everyone, Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor at The Federalist, here with Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum, also a senior contributor at The Federalist. We're going to talk about Jemele Hill, corporate darling of ESPN and Disney, a journalist at The Atlantic. Here's the tweet in question that we're going to ask Inez to really dive into.
Oh, no.
Last night, Sunday night, Jemele was apparently having a lovely evening. Been reading Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, and if you were of the opinion that the United States wasn't nearly as bad as Nazi Germany, how wrong you are. Can't encourage you enough to read this masterpiece. She then doubled down. Someone responded to her, "This is breathtakingly irresponsible. How is anyone supposed to trust your judgment after this horror show of an opinion?" Fair question. Well, Jemele has an answer for that. What would you call it when a country that murdered millions of Jews learned their systems of genocide by watching America and studying our history of racialized slavery and great knack for racial terrorism? Inez, care to respond?
Yeah, I mean, this is just, it's almost hard to respond to because it requires such a complete lack of perspective, not just about the 20th century, but about all of human history, that it's sort of staggering, and it's difficult to respond when somebody's premises are so far off from reality. They seem to have no relationship to the world in which we live and the world in which our ancestors lived. But this isn't particularly new, right? The New York Times a while back wrote something similar, right? That the three worst caste systems in recent human history were Nazi Germany, the United States, and the Indian caste system, right? And that's also the thesis of this book, Wilkinson's book that Jemele references there is a comparison between the U.S. system and the caste system in India, which is also ludicrous. There's as many things. There's a grain of truth in this. The progressive philosophy at the turn of the century, there was a lot of relationships back and forth between academics in Germany and in the United States. Of course, delving into the history of that would require talking a little bit about how the progressive movement in the United States was built, what it stood for, and to what extent its ideas remain, the intellectual heritage of the left in America today. So that's, I'm pretty sure, something that Jemele Hill did not want to dive into. But yeah, on its face, right, this is a deeply offensive comparison to anybody who actually either lived through a serious authoritarian system or a genocidal system like that in Nazi Germany, but even an authoritarian system like the USSR, or frankly, like what Venezuela is turning into. We have people across the globe as different as Hong Kongers and Belarusians now, marching in the streets knowing that at any moment they can be snatched off the street, put in detention, and in the case of both countries to be tortured in detention for doing nothing more than asking for free and fair elections that the United States takes for granted. So it is an offensive comparison, and it's one that shows absolutely no understanding or knowledge of not just recent history, as I said, but human history and sort of the condition of humankind prior to the Enlightenment, to the principles put in place in the American founding, and prior to, and then of course after that, the 20th century horrors of exactly challenging of a lot of those kinds of principles of both liberty and equality. So, yeah, I mean that's a lot of words to just say I'm like totally gobsmacked by somebody who can say these things without a hint of, and as you say, she doubled down over and over again, without a hint of sort of self-consciousness or especially when you have people telling you, this is personally offensive, right? Like anybody who actually went through this or has family who went through this, I mean, there is nothing in America that's comparable at all, not only to Nazi Germany, but to the USSR, to what's happening in Belarus and Hong Kong today. There is nothing in America comparable to that. And if you say that there is, then you are as deluded as Jemele Hill.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, that's an important point, because it's one thing to make the argument that there were ideas borrowed from the United States that were repurposed in disgusting and reprehensible ways in Nazi Germany. And I mean, that's one argument I guess you can make, but it's an entirely different thing to make that moral equivocation between both societies. And if you could talk a little bit about your family background and why this was particularly offensive to you, and especially at a time when we are seeing Belarusians. You've actually been involved in some of these protests in DC as it relates to what's happening with them right now. Can you speak a little bit to why you have, sort of personal experience with the offensiveness of such a comparison?
Yeah, and then I do want to get to the point about moral equivalence, because I think that's really important. I think it's a broader one than the narrow topic we're talking about here. The fact that America has sort of lost faith in the justice of our own project has deep implications, not just for the United States, but for the world and for, sort of leadership in the world, our leadership in the world. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to rely too heavily on personal background, but my family, my parents grew up in communist Poland under the control of the Soviet bloc, right? So Poland was outside of the USSR, but it was still part of the Warsaw Pact, and functionally controlled by the Communist Party in Russia. They had a sort of a corresponding Communist Party in Poland, but they escaped that system. Fundamentally, they came to this country with some stops along the way, but came to this country because of the promise for freedom that it offered, the promise for opportunity, and the promise really to carve out your own destiny. One of the things that I struggle to sort of articulate, and I've tried in some of my Federalist pieces, I've tried in various fora to try to articulate this, but it's something that's very difficult, and I think it's better articulated by oftentimes film or art than it is sort of in a piece or an article or a book. That the lack of agency that people have over their own lives, even in a very personal way, and the way that this kind of authoritarian system, like communism, gets in the way of personal relationships between people, and personal joys, right? Things that Americans take for granted as sort of private matters, that separation that seems to be breaking down these days between politics and private life, but is so much less distinct in authoritarian societies like the GDR, for example, where 1 in 6 people were on file as informants with the Stasi, right, the secret police. Some of those people were weaponizing personal dislike. Imagine you don't get along with your neighbor for whatever reason, you don't get along with a colleague, right? Those kinds of systems can then be weaponized, and I think we are seeing the beginnings of that in the cancel culture movement, where oftentimes it's just somebody who doesn't like you, who remembers a tweet from 10 years ago when a kid was 17, that gives people who just personally dislike you power over you. Right. But of course, the more vicious version of that was simply in places like the GDR. People had to make choices between their personal connections. How do you make a decision whether to spy on your boyfriend or your husband to get your parents out of jail? That kind of stuff destroys trust between people. It destroys authentic relationships, and I don't think there's any way I can articulate that better than some of the films that have come out in recent years. The Lives of Others, Cold War is another great one that I think demonstrates that. I reviewed it for the Federalist.
Is that the one you reviewed with your father?
Yeah.
That was a great review. Yeah, everyone can go to the website. It's really good. I'll link it in the description.
And watch the film. I mean, it's a beautiful film. Regardless, it's worth watching. It's award winning. It's an amazing movie just from sort of cinematic perspective, but it also, in my view, has a very important message about relationships and how politics can destroy relationships between human beings in this kind of society. But yeah, so I do have a personal stake in some of this, because I grew up hearing about what life was like in that kind of society, and maybe that does make me try to shine a spotlight, for example, on Belarus or Hong Kong. I know there's been a lot of great coverage of Hong Kong on the Federalist website and elsewhere. People are risking their lives. They're risking torture, not sort of in the play acting way I think we see in some of the protests in America, but in a very, very real way, a very concrete way. Electrocution doesn't get more concrete than electrocution. And actually, unfortunately, in Belarus, there are also reports that female prisoners are being raped with batons in detention centers. I mean, these are the kind of things that are happening right now in Europe in 2020, and to compare, any problems that we might have in the United States to that level of absolute destruction and control over citizens of a dictator is deeply misguided. But I do really want to get to that moral equivalency point, because, and I would love to hear, I know Emily, you focused a lot on Chinese power, soft power in the film industry and in the United States, but it seems clear, I think, to both of us that we're headed a little bit towards, or we already are in a Cold War, and we're headed towards a confrontation of some kind, hopefully not a hot one, with China. These kinds of moral equivalencies we hear more and more often, especially when we talk about, China and what they're doing to minority populations there, like the Uyghurs, Belarus, in terms of what our media is calling police brutality, to try to sort of connect it to the U.S. narrative in a way that I think is a false moral equivalency. I mean, nobody in the United States is being randomly snatched off the street, electrocuted, and raped in detention centers. So there is a false moral equivalency, but it's a problem because it makes it, we think we're unfit to lead, right? We don't think we're fit to lead the free world. Every time there's a story about one of these things happening on the far side of the world, the response from a lot of Americans is, oh, well, that's happening here because we're racist. And the idea that that's a moral equivalence is just, it's morally idiotic and obvious to anybody with two eyes, but I don't know how many people have two eyes anymore.
The reason I asked about your personal experience is because as we see people aging out of the demographic, myself included, where you were alive and had memories of the Cold War, we do see support for, quote, socialism rising in polls of young people who will eventually be, the people controlling all of our institutions. And so those memories are kind of starting to fade from the American imagination. I think it is so important to focus on films like the ones that you've covered and the stories of people like your parents who have come to this country and been successful and now enjoy all of its freedoms, and their children enjoy all of the freedoms. And I do think that's very important. I also think, to what you're saying about Jemele Hill, if you go back to the first 150 years of the American Republic, even if you take her argument that she's only talking about America pre-World War II, and that's what was sort of plucked from the American experience and then reapplied by Hitler and Nazi Germany, there's really slavery is a terrible evil. I think everybody just about acknowledges that, and it was systematic, and it did lead to the systematic deaths of many people, and obviously the loss of liberties for so many people. Is the system just, it's incomprehensible in its horrors and the way that it was systematized, absolutely. But again, when we look at this argument that you mentioned that Caste makes, where does that go wrong when it's talking about how there was when it's making this claim that America produced or was instrumental in the production of these systems?
Well, it ignores the really salient fact, which is that the principles upon which the United States was founded are a direct rebuke to all of those things, to slavery, to genocide, to treating people unequally under the law. So I don't think a single person has ever, in modern sort of debate, makes the argument that America was perfect at its founding, or that slavery wasn't in horrendous contradiction to the principles of the Declaration. And by the way, the founders weren't idiots. They were neither, idiots nor monsters. They understood the contradiction between the Declaration of Independence and the institution of slavery. And in fact, most of the people in the founding generation what they primarily argued about was how to abolish slavery, whether it would be sort of abolished slowly over time, how to do it exactly without disunion and without war, that ultimately became impossible by the time you get to the Civil War. Of course, it wasn't possible to abolish slavery without disunion and war, and we fought a very bloody Civil War. Not only about slavery, but primarily about slavery and about the necessity of not being able to exist as a country, a republic, with two vastly different sets of principles. And I think one of the most interesting things about sort of early American history that gets dropped out the way that we talk about our history is the period in between the founding and the Civil War. And I think that's probably the most uncomfortable period of time for folks like Jemele Hill, like Wilkinson, to talk about, exactly because, yes, in the 1830s, in late 1830s, early 1840s, you start to get something very different than the founding. You start to get a real defense of slavery as an institution. This is the same time, of course, that communism and socialism are percolating in Europe, right? The same general time frame, and there's quite a lot of cross-pollination across the Atlantic. Speaking of ideas, right, going back and forth and being transformed into worse forms of themselves. There was quite a lot of percolation back and forth. So there were American intellectuals in the South in the 1840s and 50s making the argument that actually, slavery was a form of communism, and that it was actually benevolent because people who couldn't fend for themselves would then be cared for as slaves, because the free market, looses them upon when they're too old to work, for example. They don't have anyone to take care of them. And so these were the arguments that were being made in the 1840s and 1850s. And I think it's incomprehensible for the left to imagine that Thomas Jefferson and the founding generation had a clearer picture of the evils of slavery than people did 50 years later, because that doesn't make any sense in their sort of the Hegelian wheel of history, their trajectory, that we're progressing always to a higher plane of equality, and we can never slip backwards into 1,000 years of darkness. Well, that's what happened in the United States, intellectually speaking. We had a founding generation that understood the horrors of slavery and were, focused on the practical question of how to extract themselves from this evil institution without causing bloodshed or disunion, which would have meant the United States would have been carved up by European powers at that point. So, focus on this question, but fairly clear on the morality of slavery, or rather the immorality of slavery, to a point where you had a large part of the country that was actively arguing that slavery was a good institution, and in fact arguing that it was a good institution for slaves. That progression is not supposed to happen in the sort of leftist conception of history, right? We're not supposed to go backwards, but that's what happened. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue with somebody who doesn't see that, for example, slavery is not a unique institution to the United States, that slavery was a part of a vicious part of human history. Yes, it had its own stamp here, had a racialized character here, as opposed to perhaps a tribal one versus a broader racial character here. But I mean, slavery was common in Africa. That's why slaves were initially sold to traders who then brought them both to the United States, to the West Indies, to where slavery, and Haiti, where slavery was incredibly vicious. This is not a new institution, and in fact, the principles of the United States that underlie our system are the reason that slavery was able to be abolished. They're a rebuke to these kinds of things.
That's what I think is so important, because we talk about how this is offensive to people who lived in these systems. And I also think that it's one thing that people don't talk about is that this is offensive to the people who spilled their blood in this country to realize the promise of our founding documents. And to, like, President Obama talked about how the Constitution had a North Star embedded in it at a speech at the DNC last week. And a lot of people spilled blood for us to follow that North Star and to create a society that, while imperfect, over the course of our history has improved, even if we've had some dips. But people died and people lost everything, and people have fought so bitterly to improve the United States, even in those years before the Second World War. I think it's offensive to them. And what this gets to, my final question for you is, this is, it seems, an extension or basically a part of the 1619 project's larger project, which basically is to poison the next generations of Americans on the country's history. And I don't really understand where that ends, because it's a very glass half full, or glass half empty, I'm sorry, perspective on something that over the course of world history, the United States, the only way that you can look at it is glass half full. We've accomplished so much, and so much more than other societies have ever been able to. Where do you think this ends? Is that what concerns you most?
Yeah, I'll be blunt about it. It ends either in disunion or in tribalism. And ultimately, it's impossible to embrace critical race theory, identity politics as practiced by the nation's academia, and now, unfortunately, in broader cultural institutions like Fortune 500 corporate boardrooms.
Jemele Hill works for Disney in
right.
ESPN, and she's an Atlantic journalist.
Yeah. In those institutions, unfortunately, and we've talked about why that's the case in other places, but it's impossible. That is an ideology that is not compatible with diverse peoples of the United States living as citizens with one another. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's so incredibly dangerous not to have that perspective, that 1,000 years of darkness, possibility in your mind, because there is nothing that prevents, liberal democracy is not inevitable. Most of human history was characterized by systems that were authoritarian, by chaos, by violence, and certainly not by protecting the liberties and equality under the law that we have in the United States, however imperfect that may be. But the logical endpoint of this kind of identity politics is for us not to be able to live alongside each other and to recognize our common citizenship. And that, for the United States, which has never been actually a tribe, right? So comparatively to European countries, most European countries were founded essentially more or less on a tribe that, sort of added similar tribes, and there was a sort of unification of tribes, and then there were national borders. I mean, I'm simplifying hundreds of years of history here, but you get the point, right? Like, they started out as tribes that they have that sort of kinship or imagined kinship ties. And yes, there's immigration. Yes, there are multiple peoples and the borders get messy. But fundamentally, their history has been sort of the act of seaming together similar tribes with sort of kinship ties. The United States never had that. The United States was a multi-ethnic country, a diverse country from day one, no matter what critical race theorists want to think about, whiteness or whatever. The reality is that the peoples who moved here had a very different idea of them. They didn't see themselves as one people or one nation. And we desperately need a creed. We need, even to some extent, even though I think the history is very defensible of the founding, the history itself, the accurate history is very defensible. But even if it weren't, we need that kind of founding mythology and, the creed that it inspired in order to seam us together. And that's something that I think is completely lost on the folks who are rushing towards identity politics now. This country can fall apart. It can, split up into a bunch of tribes. It can, our diversity has been an enormous strength for us, exactly because we've always emphasized what we had in common, which was the American creed, what we all paid allegiance to. If we stop doing that, I greatly fear for the future of this country. I think it'll break down very, very quickly as people revert to sort of their tribal nature. And that's, we above all countries, we can't have a real tribal identity politics in the United States. I think it's much more dangerous here than it is almost anywhere else.
Inez, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people follow you on Twitter?
You can follow me on Twitter at Inez Felcher, but you type in Inez Stepman, it works too. I just can't change my handle because Jack won't give me a blue check. I got it when it was easy to get the blue check. So Inez Felcher, and you can find my work and my colleagues' work at iwf.org.
Absolutely. Well, Inez, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emily.